Imagine a perfect place where peace and harmony reign, a place where man and woman live in direct communion with their Creator. But what if this perfection were challenged? What if a choice could change the destiny of humanity forever? Our story today takes us to the Garden of Eden, where God created the first human beings. But what happened in that perfect paradise? Why did Adam and Eve, created in the image and likeness of God, fall into temptation? The answers to these questions shape our understanding of the world to this day. A story of love, free will, and consequences. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Genesis 2:7. In the beginning of time, when the earth was young and full of possibilities, God created a special garden called Eden. This paradise was a place of unmatched beauty, with crystal-clear rivers, majestic trees, and lush flowers. The air was pure and fresh, filled with the harmonious sounds of birds and the gentle hum of insects. It was a place of peace and perfection, where every detail reflected the love and creativity of the Creator. In the center of this wonderful garden, God planted two very special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These trees had a divine purpose, though their full significance was still a mystery. It was in this idyllic setting that God decided to create his masterpiece, the human being. With infinite care and love, he formed Adam from the dust of the ground. God leaned over his creation and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In that magical moment, Adam opened his eyes and took his first breath. He looked around, amazed by the beauty of the garden and the loving presence of his Creator. Adam felt a deep connection with God, an intimacy that filled every fiber of his being. He explored the garden with curiosity and joy, naming every animal and plant as God showed them to him. His mind was filled with knowledge and wisdom, a reflection of the divine image within him. But God saw that it was not good for Adam to be alone. He wanted to give Adam a companion, someone who could share the beauty of Eden and the love of God. So the Lord caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep. While Adam slept, God performed the first surgery in history. With divine skill, he removed one of Adam's ribs. From this rib, God formed Eve, the first woman. When Adam awoke and saw Eve for the first time, his heart was filled with joy and admiration. He recognized in her a part of himself, yet also a unique and wonderful creation. Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony in the Garden of Eden. They tended the garden, enjoyed each other's company, and above all had an intimate relationship with God. Every morning they walked with the Creator in the cool of the day, talking openly and learning more about the world around them. There was no shame, fear, or distrust. They were naked but felt no shame, for innocence was their garment. Work was a joy, not a burden. Each day brought new discoveries and moments of deep connection with creation and the Creator. God gave Adam and Eve the freedom to enjoy everything in the garden, with only one restriction. He warned them not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, God warned them. This single rule was not a burden but an opportunity for Adam and Eve to demonstrate their love and obedience to God. They understood the importance of this command and promised to honor it. Life in Eden continued in perfect happiness, with Adam and Eve living in communion with God and each other. But not everything would remain peaceful in paradise. A sinister presence lurked in the shadows of the garden, watching the couple with envy and malice. It was the serpent, the most cunning of all the wild animals that God had made. This being, who was actually Satan in disguise, planned to destroy the perfect harmony between God and his most beloved creatures. The serpent waited patiently, seeking the right moment to plant its poisonous doubts in the hearts of Adam and Eve. It knew it needed to act subtly to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve continued their idyllic life in Eden. They explored every corner of the garden, marveling at the new discoveries they made each day. The fruits were sweet and juicy, the flowers exuded intoxicating fragrances, and the animals lived in perfect harmony. Eve, in particular, loved spending time near the two special trees in the center of the garden. She often gazed at the tree of life, admiring its beauty and the deep significance it carried. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on the other hand, intrigued her. One day, as Eve wandered alone through the garden, she approached the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent saw its opportunity and quietly approached her. With a soft and persuasive voice, it caught Eve's attention. "Hello, beautiful creature," said the serpent, its eyes gleaming with a disturbing intelligence. Eve, surprised to hear an animal speak, responded with curiosity. The conversation that would follow would change the course of human history forever. The serpent, with carefully chosen words, began to plant seeds of doubt in Eve's mind. "Is it true that God said you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" the serpent asked, feigning innocence. Feeling compelled to defend God, Eve promptly replied, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it. Otherwise, you will die.'" The serpent smiled inwardly, knowing it had captured Eve's attention. It knew now was the moment to sow the doubt that would shake Eve's faith in God. With a conspiratorial tone, the serpent whispered, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." These words struck Eve like lightning. The idea of being like God, of having knowledge beyond what she already possessed, was tempting. She looked at the fruit with new eyes, seeing it not as something forbidden but as a key to a new level of existence. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now it began to grow rapidly in Eve's heart. Eve stood there, contemplating the forbidden fruit. Her mind was in turmoil, torn between loyalty to God and the newly awakened desire for more knowledge. The serpent watched silently, knowing its words were having an effect. Eve reached out hesitantly toward the fruit. She could smell its sweet fragrance, see its smooth and shiny skin. Everything about it seemed inviting, promising revelations and power. With a quick motion, Eve plucked the fruit from the tree. Her heart raced as she held it, feeling its weight in her hands. Without further hesitation, Eve bit into the fruit. The taste was sweeter than anything she had ever experienced. But with the sweetness came a strange, new sensation. Something within her changed instantly. She felt as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. The world around her seemed different, more complex. Eve looked at her hands, at her body, and for the first time felt a pang of shame for her nakedness. But along with this shame came a sense of power, of newfound knowledge. She quickly turned, searching for Adam. She needed to share this new experience with him. Eve found Adam not far away. Her eyes glowed with a different light, and Adam immediately sensed that something had changed. "Adam," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have tasted the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Adam was shocked, unable to believe what he was hearing. He looked at the half-eaten fruit in Eve's hand, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. Eve continued, describing the sensation she had experienced, the new knowledge she felt coursing through her veins. Her words were persuasive, and Adam found himself drawn to the idea. With a mixture of reluctance and desire, Adam took the fruit from Eve's hand. He knew he was about to disobey the one rule God had established, but the desire to share this new experience with Eve was too strong. With a deep sigh, Adam brought the fruit to his mouth and took a bite. The moment the taste touched his tongue, Adam felt the same transformation that Eve had described. His mind expanded, filled with knowledge that had previously been hidden from him. But along with this knowledge came a painful awareness of his own vulnerability and nakedness. Suddenly, the garden that once seemed so welcoming became threatening. Adam and Eve looked at each other with new eyes, conscious of their nakedness in a way they had never been before. Ashamed, they ran to hide among the trees. With fig leaves, they made coverings for themselves, in a desperate attempt to hide their newly discovered nakedness. The paradise they had known began to fade around them as the reality of their actions started to weigh heavily on them. The sound of God's footsteps in the garden, which once brought joy, now filled them with terror. The sound of God's footsteps echoed through the garden, bringing an unfamiliar terror to the hearts of Adam and Eve. For the first time, they did not run joyfully to meet their Creator. Instead, they hid among the trees, trying to escape the divine gaze. Fear consumed them, an emotion they had never experienced before. Their bodies trembled and their hearts raced. The presence of God, which once filled them with peace and contentment, now seemed threatening. They knew they had done something terrible, something that would change everything forever. God's voice resonated through the garden, calling out to Adam. "Where are you?" the Creator asked. This question was not a request for information. God, in His omniscience, knew exactly where Adam was. It was an invitation to confess, an opportunity for Adam to face the consequences of his actions. Gathering all his courage, Adam replied in a trembling voice, "I heard you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." His words revealed not only his disobedience but also the profound change that had occurred within him. Innocence had been replaced by fear and shame. In His infinite wisdom, God immediately perceived what had happened. He asked Adam, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" At that moment, Adam had the chance to take full responsibility for his actions. However, fear and shame led him down a different path. Instead of admitting his guilt, Adam pointed to Eve, saying, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it." With these words, Adam not only blamed Eve, but indirectly blamed God Himself for giving him the woman as a companion. God then turned to Eve, asking, "What is this you have done?" Following Adam's example, Eve also sought to shift the blame. "The serpent deceived me and I ate," she replied. The circle of blame was complete. Adam blamed Eve and God, and Eve blamed the serpent. Neither was willing to take full responsibility for their actions. This moment marked a fundamental change in the relationship between humanity and God. Trust had been broken, and the consequences would be severe and lasting. In His perfect justice, God pronounced judgment on each involved. Beginning with the serpent, He declared, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This curse affected not only the physical serpent, but also symbolized the eternal battle between good and evil that would follow. For Eve, the judgment was equally severe. God said, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." What had once been a harmonious partnership between man and woman would now become a relationship marked by pain and conflict. The beautiful experience of motherhood would be accompanied by physical pain, and the balance in the relationship between man and woman would be disturbed. This judgment reflected the consequences of her choice to seek wisdom and power outside God's will. Adam also received his judgment. God declared, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are and to dust you will return." Work, which had once been a source of joy and fulfillment, became arduous and exhausting. The ground, which had previously produced abundantly, would now require effort and sweat to yield food. The consequences of Adam and Eve's sin extended beyond themselves, affecting all of creation. The perfect harmony of Eden was broken. Animals that once lived in peace with one another would now become predators and prey. Plants that once bore fruit easily would now produce thorns and thistles. Death, which had been unknown in the garden, entered the world as a direct result of disobedience. God's original plan for his creation had been altered by man's choice to follow his own path. Despite the severity of the judgment, God demonstrated mercy. He made garments of skin for Adam and Eve, covering their nakedness and shame. This act not only provided physical protection, but also symbolized God's continued care for his creatures, even after the fall. It was the first sacrifice, foreshadowing the ultimate sacrifice that would one day be made to redeem humanity. In this gesture, we see a glimpse of the redemption plan that God already had in mind even in this moment of judgment. God then made a painful but necessary decision. He said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever." To protect Adam and Eve from an eternity in their fallen state, God expelled them from the Garden of Eden. He placed cherubim and a flaming sword to the east of the garden to guard the way to the tree of life. This act of expulsion, though severe, was actually an act of mercy, preventing humanity from living eternally in a state of sin and separation from God. Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, entering a world very different from the one they had known. The paradise that had been their home was now out of reach. They would face hardships, pain, and eventually death. But they carried with them the promise implicit in the serpent's curse, the promise that one day evil would be defeated. This promise would be the thread of hope running throughout human history, pointing to the day when the relationship between God and humanity would be restored. Though banished from the physical Eden, Adam and Eve, and all humanity after them, would still bear the image of God and the potential for a restored relationship with their Creator. Adam and Eve took their first steps outside the Garden of Eden, entering a world drastically different from the one they had known. The air felt heavier, the ground harder beneath their feet. They looked around, seeing a landscape that, though still beautiful, lacked the perfection of the paradise they had left behind. The reality of their new situation began to weigh on them. They could no longer walk with God in the cool of the day, or enjoy the abundant fruits the garden had so freely offered. Now, each meal would be the result of hard work and sweat. Eve placed her hand on her belly, thinking of God's words about the pain of childbirth that was to come. Adam looked at his hands, imagining the calluses that would form as he worked the ground to extract his sustenance from it. The weight of responsibility for their actions fell on them like never before. They had traded innocence for knowledge, eternity for mortality, perfection for imperfection. And yet, amidst the sorrow and regret, there was a spark of hope. God's promise about the offspring of Eve, who would one day crush the serpent's head, echoed in their minds. Days passed, turning into weeks and months. Adam and Eve learned to survive in this new world. Adam worked the land, battling thorns and weeds to grow food. His hands, once smooth, were now calloused and rough. Eve learned to sew clothes, prepare food, and care for their makeshift home. Together, they faced the challenges of this new world, leaning on each other in times of difficulty. Their relationship, though marked by the consequences of sin, was still a source of comfort and companionship. One day, Eve felt the first contractions. The moment she had both dreaded and anticipated had arrived. With pain and effort, she gave birth to her first son, Cain. Holding the baby in her arms, Eve experienced a mix of emotions: joy at the miracle of life, sadness for the lost innocence her child would never know, and hope that perhaps this was the offspring God had promised. "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord," she declared, acknowledging God's hand even in this fallen world. Not long after, Eve gave birth to another son, Abel. The brothers grew up together, but it soon became clear that they were very different from one another. Cain became a farmer, working the land like his father. Abel, on the other hand, became a shepherd. Both sons learned about God from their parents, hearing stories about the Garden of Eden and the promise of redemption. Adam and Eve watched their sons grow, seeing in them both the image of God and the effects of the sin they had brought into the world. One day, the time came for Cain and Abel to present offerings to God. Cain brought some of the fruits of the land, the result of his work in the field. Abel, in turn, brought the firstborn of his flock, the best lambs he had. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, but not on Cain's. This difference in treatment sparked a flame of jealousy and anger in Cain's heart. He couldn't understand why his offering hadn't been accepted, and bitterness began to grow within him. In his mercy, God spoke to Cain. "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." These words were both a warning and an invitation. God was giving Cain the opportunity to recognize his error, change his heart, and do what was right. But Cain, consumed by envy and anger, ignored God's warning. On a fateful day, Cain invited his brother Abel to go out into the field. Away from their parents' eyes, away from the protective presence of the camp, Cain let his anger take over. In a moment of blind rage, he attacked his brother. Abel's blood stained the ground, crying out to God from the earth. The first murder had been committed, brother against brother, son against son. The sin that had entered the world through Adam and Eve now manifested in its most horrifying form through their firstborn. God once again approached man. "Where is your brother Abel?" he asked Cain. Just as he had done with Adam and Eve in the garden, God was giving Cain the opportunity to confess his sin. But Cain, hardened by hatred and fear, responded with a lie. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" His response revealed not only the magnitude of his crime, but also the depth of the separation between man and God that sin had caused. God's voice thundered in response. "What have you done? Listen. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." God's judgment on Cain was severe, reflecting the gravity of his crime. Cain, who had taken his brother's life, now faced a life of exile and fear. Finally realizing the weight of his actions, Cain cried out to God, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Even in the face of this lament, God showed mercy. He placed a mark on Cain, warning that anyone who killed him would suffer vengeance 7 times over. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Adam and Eve, in their camp, anxiously awaited the return of their sons. When only Cain returned, with blood-stained hands and a face marked by guilt, they knew something terrible had happened. The news of Abel's death hit them like a devastating blow. Eve, who had already experienced the pain of childbirth, now knew an even deeper pain, the loss of a child. Adam, who had brought death into the world through his disobedience, now saw that death claimed the life of his own son. The couple, once the only inhabitants of paradise, now faced the most terrible consequences of their choice. Death, which had been merely an abstract concept in Eden, had become a cruel and tangible reality. They mourned for Abel, lamented for Cain, and wondered how things had come to this. Amid their pain, they turned to each other and to God, seeking comfort and strength to carry on. The promise of a Redeemer, someone who would one day crush the serpent's head, became more precious than ever. Time passed, but the pain of losing Abel and the exile of Cain remained as open wounds in the hearts of Adam and Eve. Each day brought new challenges and constant reminders of the consequences of their actions in the Garden of Eden. The world around them seemed to reflect the chaos that now resided in their hearts. The seasons grew harsher, the animals more fierce, and the land more reluctant to yield its fruits. Yet amidst the adversity, Adam and Eve clung to God's promise of a future Redeemer. Eve, determined not to be consumed by despair, turned to God in prayer. She pleaded for another chance, for a child who could bring hope back into their lives. God, in His infinite mercy, heard Eve's cry, not long after she conceived again. When the baby was born, a strong and healthy boy, Eve named him Seth, saying, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him." In this name, Eve expressed both her pain and her hope, the pain of losing Abel and the hope of a new beginning. Seth grew up in the shadow of his brother's story, but with a heart turned toward God. Unlike Cain, he sought to please the Lord in everything he did. Adam and Eve watched their son with a mixture of love and apprehension, fearing that tragedy might repeat itself. But as Seth grew, it became clear that he was different. He had inherited Adam's strength and Eve's compassion, but he also possessed a wisdom that seemed to come directly from God. Through Seth, Adam and Eve began to glimpse the possibility of a better future for humanity. As the years went by, Adam and Eve saw their family grow. They had other sons and daughters, and soon found themselves surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. With each new generation, they recounted the story of the Garden of Eden, the fall, and God's promise. They taught their descendants about the importance of obeying God and living in harmony with one another. Although the world around them was full of hardships, they strove to keep alive the memory of the paradise they had known and the hope of the paradise God had promised to restore. As they aged, Adam and Eve reflected on their lives. They remembered the perfection of Eden, the innocence they had lost, and the children they had raised. They thought of Cain, wandering the earth, bearing the weight of his crime. They remembered Abel, whose life had been brutally cut short, and they looked at Seth and his descendants, seeing in them the hope for a better future. Despite all the difficulties, they recognized God's hand guiding them through the years, sustaining them amidst the trials. One day, Adam gathered his family around him. His voice, though weakened by age, still carried authority. He spoke about the Garden of Eden, describing its beauty and perfection with a clarity that surprised everyone. He told of creation, of how God had formed him from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. He spoke of Eve's creation, taken from his own rib to be his perfect companion. And then, with tears in his eyes, he spoke of the fall, of how they had disobeyed God and brought sin into the world. But Adam didn't stop there. With renewed energy, he spoke about God's promise. "Even in our moment of greatest failure," he said, "God promised that one day someone would come who would crush the serpent's head, that someone will undo what we've done, restore what we've lost. I don't know when it will happen, but I know it will. God is faithful, and His promise is certain." These words, filled with faith and hope, deeply touched the hearts of everyone present. It was a powerful reminder that, despite all the difficulties, there was a greater plan at work. Eve, sitting beside Adam, then took the floor. She spoke about the pain of giving birth in a fallen world, the joy of watching her children grow, and the anguish of losing Abel and Cain in such different ways. But like Adam, she also spoke of hope. "Every child born," she said, "is a reminder of God's goodness. Every act of love, every moment of forgiveness, every choice to do good instead of evil is a step toward the restoration God has promised. Do not lose hope, my dear ones. The day will come when all will be made new." As Adam and Eve spoke, a respectful silence fell over the gathering. Everyone present felt the weight of the story being told, a story in which they were a part. It was a story of the fall, yes, but also a story of ongoing redemption. The words of Adam and Eve served as a powerful reminder that, despite the difficulties of the present, a glorious future awaited those who remained faithful to God. In the days that followed, the words of Adam and Eve echoed in the hearts of their descendants. Many felt inspired to seek a closer relationship with God, to live in a way that honored the Creator. Unfortunately, others chose to follow their own paths, drifting further away from God. Humanity began to divide between those who sought God and those who rejected Him, a division that would deepen with each passing generation. Adam and Eve watched these changes with a mixture of hope and concern. They saw in their descendants both the potential for good and the inclination toward evil. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and temptations, but they also knew that God had not abandoned humanity. The promise of the Redeemer still stood, and they trusted that, in due time, God would fulfill His word. As they neared the end of their lives, Adam and Eve reflected on all they had experienced. They had known the perfection of Eden and the harshness of the fallen world. They had experienced indescribable joys and unimaginable sorrows. They had seen the best and worst of humanity, and through it all, they had learned to trust in God, even when they didn't understand His ways. Now, they were preparing to leave a legacy, not just a warning about the consequences of sin, but also a hope in God's faithfulness and love. But Adam didn't stop there. With renewed energy, he spoke about God's promise. Even in our moment of greatest failure, he said, God promised that one day someone would come who would crush the serpent's head, that someone will undo what we've done, restore what we've lost. I don't know when it will happen, but I know it will. God is faithful, and His promise is certain. These words, filled with faith and hope, deeply touched the hearts of everyone present. It was a powerful reminder that, despite all the difficulties, there was a greater plan at work. Eve, sitting beside Adam, then took the floor. She spoke about the pain of giving birth in a fallen world, the joy of watching her children grow, and the anguish of losing Abel and Cain in such different ways. But like Adam, she also spoke of hope. Every child born, she said, is a reminder of God's goodness. Every act of love, every moment of forgiveness, every choice to do good instead of evil is a step toward the restoration God has promised. Do not lose hope, my dear ones. The day will come when all will be made new. As Adam and Eve spoke, a respectful silence fell over the gathering. Everyone present felt the weight of the story being told, a story in which they were a part. It was a story of the fall, yes, but also a story of ongoing redemption. The words of Adam and Eve served as a powerful reminder that, despite the difficulties of the present, a glorious future awaited those who remained faithful to God. In the days that followed, the words of Adam and Eve echoed in the hearts of their descendants. Many felt inspired to seek a closer relationship with God, to live in a way that honored the Creator. Unfortunately, others chose to follow their own paths, drifting further away from God. Humanity began to divide between those who sought God and those who rejected Him, a division that would deepen with each passing generation. Adam and Eve watched these changes with a mixture of hope and concern. They saw in their descendants both the potential for good and the inclination toward evil. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and temptations, but they also knew that God had not abandoned humanity. The promise of the Redeemer still stood, and they trusted that, in due time, God would fulfill His word. As they neared the end of their lives, Adam and Eve reflected on all they had experienced. They had known the perfection of Eden and the harshness of the fallen world. They had experienced indescribable joys and unimaginable sorrows. They had seen the best and worst of humanity, and through it all, they had learned to trust in God, even when they didn't understand His ways. Now, they were preparing to leave a legacy, not just a warning about the consequences of sin, but also a hope in God's faithfulness and love. Adam and Eve's days on earth were coming to an end. Their bodies, once perfect and immortal, now showed the signs of time and the hardships they had faced. But their spirits remained strong, sustained by faith in God's promise. They knew their earthly journey was ending, but they were also certain that this was not truly the end. The death they had brought into the world was now approaching them. But instead of fear, they felt a strange peace, knowing that even death could not separate them from the love of God. On a quiet day, Adam called Seth to his side. With a weak but firm voice, he said, "My son, I feel that my time is coming to an end. Before I go, I want you to know something important. Our story, the story of the fall, is not the end. It is only the beginning of something greater. God promised a Redeemer, someone who will come to restore what we have lost. I don't know when it will happen, but I know it will. Keep that hope alive, Seth. Teach it to your children and to their children. Don't let the world forget God's promise. Eve, lying beside Adam, added her own words of wisdom. Seth, my dear, you were born into a world already stained by sin. You never knew the perfection of Eden as we did. But don't let that discourage you. In every act of kindness, in every moment of love, we see reflections of the paradise we lost. And one day, I am sure, we will see more than just reflections. Trust in God, Seth. He is faithful, even when we don't understand his ways. Seth listened to his parents' words with tears in his eyes. He promised to keep the memory of Eden alive and the hope of the promised Redeemer. He promised to teach his children about God's goodness and the dangers of sin. And above all, he promised to keep the faith that his parents had cultivated through so many years of trials and blessings. Adam and Eve smiled, satisfied to know that their legacy would continue through Seth and his descendants. In the days that followed, Adam and Eve said their goodbyes to their other sons and daughters, to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. For each one, they had words of love, wisdom, and hope. They recalled stories of Eden, warned about the consequences of sin, and reaffirmed God's promise. Every conversation was precious, every moment a treasure. They knew these would be their last words to their loved ones, and they wanted each word to count. Finally, the day came when Adam felt his strength fading. He looked at Eve, his companion of so many years, and saw in her eyes the same understanding. It was time. With one last effort, Adam raised his voice in prayer. Lord God, you formed us from the dust of the earth. You gave us life and placed us in Eden. We sinned against you and brought death into the world. But you, in your mercy, did not abandon us. You promised a Redeemer. Now, as we return to dust, we trust in your promise. May your name be glorified now and forever. Eve joined her voice to Adam's. Heavenly Father, you created me to be a suitable helper for Adam. We failed in our mission in Eden, but you sustained us through all our trials. We saw your goodness in every sunrise, in every harvest, in every new birth. Now, as we close our eyes to this world, we open them to the hope of your redemption. May our descendants never forget your love and your promises. With these words, Adam and Eve closed their eyes for the last time. Their spirits left their earthly bodies, returning to the Creator who had formed them. Seth and the rest of the family wept, mourning the loss of humanity's first parents. But amid the sadness, there was a sense of peace and purpose. Adam and Eve had completed their earthly journey, leaving behind a legacy of faith, hope, and love. In the days that followed, Seth led the family in preparing Adam and Eve's bodies for burial. It was a solemn moment, laden with meaning. As they lowered the bodies into the ground, Seth reminded everyone of God's words. From dust you came, and to dust you will return. But he also reminded them of the promise of the Redeemer, the hope that one day death would be defeated and eternal life restored. The story of Adam and Eve did not end with their deaths. On the contrary, it was only the beginning of a much larger narrative. Through Seth and his descendants, the lineage of the promise continued. Generation after generation, the story of Eden was told, the fall was remembered, and the promise of the Redeemer was kept alive. There were times of faithfulness and times of rebellion, moments of great closeness to God, and periods of distance. But through it all, God's plan continued to unfold. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Humanity spread across the earth, carrying with it the legacy of Adam and Eve, the tendency to sin, and the ability to love and create. And through all this time, God never forgot his promise. He continued to work in human history, preparing the way for the fulfillment of his word. Finally, in a small town called Bethlehem, a baby was born. He didn't come with great pomp or circumstance, but his birth marked the beginning of the fulfillment of the ancient promise. This baby, Jesus Christ, was the long-promised Redeemer. Through his life, death, and resurrection, he would pave the way for the restoration of what was lost in Eden. The serpent would be crushed, sin would be defeated, and the communion between God and humanity would be restored. The story of Adam and Eve is, therefore, much more than a tale of the past. It is a story that points to the future, to the hope of redemption that finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. It is a reminder that despite our faults and failures, God never gives up on us. It is a testament to the faithfulness of God, who keeps his promises even when it seems impossible. And so, the narrative that began in the Garden of Eden continues to this day. Each of us is a part of that story, heirs of both Adam's fall and the redemption offered by Christ. The choice that Adam and Eve faced in the garden is the same one we face every day, to trust and obey God or to follow our own path. But thanks to Christ's sacrifice, we have the opportunity to choose life, to accept forgiveness, and to enter into a restored relationship with our Creator. As we reflect on the story of Adam and Eve, we are challenged to consider our own spiritual journey. Where are we in this grand narrative of creation, fall, and redemption? Are we living in the light of the promise fulfilled in Christ? Are we sharing this message of hope with others? May we, like Adam and Eve in their final days, look beyond our present circumstances and fix our eyes on God's promise, the promise of a new heaven and a new earth, where communion with God will be fully restored and where Eden will be not just a distant memory, but a glorious and eternal reality.